So now let's get down to the local blues. Baton Rouge and its blues community, because of a cultural map, right? Baton Rouge became famous in its own state for blues. Like New Orleans became famous for jazz, the Southwest Corridor became famous for Zydeco, and the North became famous for rock and country, right? So picture blues formulating. Buddy Bolden and people like that are running around writing a lot of blues songs and doing a lot of stuff, and they're influencing the market. Now you get up to Guitar Slim, Lightning Hopkins, Buddy Guy. A guy like Buddy Guy was not a star yet in those times. He was actually playing in Rafe O'Neill's band, right? A guy like Rafe O'Neill wasn't a star yet. He was playing in Slim Harpo's band, right? So these were the major players. Buddy Guy veers off and he goes into Chicago, right? Slim Harpo ends up at the Apollo Theater. You know, J.D. Miller in Crowley, Louisiana, is capturing all of this. Lazy Lester, people like that. These are the old heads. Arthur Guitar Kelly, Rudy Richard. Research those names, check them out, and you'll see some Louisiana blues developing. So they came up with a name for this blues, and they call it swamp blues, right? And swamp blues was almost similar to a Delta style, but not. So with those components, Baton Rouge blues carved its niche out and created its own sound. Now today's bluesmen in Baton Rouge, myself, Henry Turner, a bluesman, I'm playing mostly, you know, Louisiana rhythms, but it has influences of swamp blues. You know, I play some of these styles like Tabby Thomas used to play. Now, if you take a guy like Kenny Neal, who's a second generation blues guy, who saw the onset of like a Buddy Guy, who was around all of the older blues greats, you know, I remember Kenny and I were having a conversation, and he was telling me how Little Walter, Muddy Waters, and some guys came down to play the Temple Roof in Baton Rouge. And they were from the Delta, but they had been living in Chicago. So these guys were rough, because they're surviving Chicago in the industrial area, you know, in the industrial environment. And they came down and they had some disputes with some of the Baton Rouge musicians and a couple other people about time on stage and this, that, and the other. And they ended up in like fights. They all had weapons, but they were fighting on the Temple Roof. And he said, you know, it was really interesting because, you know, guys like Little Walter was from New Orleans. I mean, so he was a hardcore project, gangster kind of guy. A guy like Muddy Waters was from the Delta. He basically had, you know, plowed in the fields, and his logic was a little bit different. And he was the boss. He was the guy that was running the whole thing. But you had these guys, like a guy from New Orleans who, you know, didn't want to hear anything about being second class, didn't want to hear anything about whatever. And a guy like Muddy Waters was like, yes, sir, unless you disrespected him. And then he would become, you know, uncapped or whatever. The local blues guys bring a lot of flavor to the table. And if you put us all on a festival, it's like a major conglomerate of like, wow. You know, the Baton Rouge blues sound is huge, it's big.